is the government doing enough? If you look at official press releases, you see this narrative of support packages, tax adjustments, and energy credits acting as a lifeline. But contrast that with the very real dread of checking your bank balance at the end of the month, and you hear a totally different story. One where it's simply not enough, and the gap between your wages and basic survival is just getting wider week by week. To answer that question fairly, we really have to break this massive, kind of abstract idea of the cost of living down into the actual monthly bills putting the most pressure on consumers. We're talking about housing, energy, food, and transport. And remember, these aren't just optional line items, right? These are non-negotiable survival costs. Each one has its own underlying causes and, crucially, its own limits on what a government can realistically fix.
Let's get into Section 1, the surging energy bill, fast impacts, and geopolitical pressures.
So the underlying reality here is that Ireland is highly exposed. Because we import a massive portion of our energy, a conflict literally thousands of miles away can dictate whether a family can afford to turn the heat on this winter. Whenever global gas prices spike or geopolitical instability hits, you feel it almost instantly in your bills and every single time you pull up to the pump. It is an international shockwave that lands directly on your kitchen table. Now, the government has definitely taken action. They've rolled out energy credits to offset household bills, and they temporarily reduced excise duties, basically lowering the taxes you pay on fuel. But there's a huge tension here. The government is essentially trying to treat the symptoms of a massive global issue using temporary credits, rather than curing the international root cause, which, to be fair, they can't. They simply don't control global oil or gas prices. As one of our sources perfectly puts it, it doesn't reduce the underlying cost, it just softens the blow. And that's the absolute crux of it. While these direct payments and tax cuts provide some temporary relief to your monthly budget, the base prices remain remarkably high. The problem doesn't go away, it just hangs over the family's head until the next billing cycle. The pain is delayed, not erased. Okay, moving to Section 2, the high cost of housing, the biggest monthly expense. Whether you're renting or paying a mortgage, the housing reality right now is just stark. Rents in Ireland have reached historic highs, and house prices are surging right alongside them. And why? Well, it's entirely driven by a massive ongoing constraint in the supply of available homes. There simply are not enough homes. This means families are either caught in vicious bidding wars or forced to pay a massive premium just to keep a roof over their heads. Now, the government isn't ignoring this. You've probably heard about schemes like Help to Buy, various first-time buyer supports, or rent pressure zones. But from the inside of a struggling household, from the perspective of someone paying astronomical rent while desperately trying to scrape together a deposit, it often doesn't feel like these measures are making a tangible dent in their day-to-day reality. And here's why. Increasing housing supply isn't something you can just switch on. It requires moving through planning, then construction, and then putting in the necessary infrastructure. It's a painfully slow process. So while these policies exist and are in motion, the impact is highly gradual. And let's be honest, gradual progress doesn't help a family pay this month's rent. This creates a severe timing mismatch. Think about it. Households feel the financial impact of the cost of living instantly. Groceries go up today, rent goes up this month. But the government's response, like building new homes or rolling out major policy shifts, arrives at a crawl. Sometimes, by the time the relief actually arrives, the economic situation has already shifted again. Which brings us to Section 3, wages versus inflation, the income side of the ledger. Even though wages have increased in some sectors, the pace of inflation is absolutely devouring those gains. When the cost of basic essentials rises faster than your paycheck, you are effectively getting poorer despite working just as hard. This is the very real, very frustrating math confronting families trying to balance their budgets right now. While the government obviously doesn't control private sector wages directly, they do have specific levers they can pull. They manage minimum wage policy, negotiate public sector pay agreements, and control taxation. But as you can imagine, pulling these levers leads us into a massive, highly sensitive policy balancing act. Let's look at Section 4, the Policy Balancing Act, short-term relief versus long-term sustainability. You might be wondering, why doesn't the government just aggressively slash taxes on essentials to give households an immediate break? Well, it's a tightrope. Cutting taxes heavily gives instant budget relief for the household, sure, but that directly means less government revenue. That strips vital funding from essential public services, delays the infrastructure needed to build more housing, and risks creating massive national deficits that future generations will have to pay for. Every single policy decision comes with severe trade-offs. If they increase spending too much, they risk fueling even more inflation. If they intervene too heavily, they trigger unintended side effects. Critics argue that the current approach prioritizes cautious, long-term economic stability at a time when households are loudly demanding urgent, immediate relief.
Let's move to Section 5, the growing pressure, perception, reality, and unrest. This huge gap between the real-time pain households are feeling and the gradual government response is fueling immense frustration. We've seen this unrest visibly manifest in events like the 2026 Irish field protests. People are reacting to the sheer pressure of just trying to get by. And what's really interesting here is a historical parallel from our sources. They actually compare this to the supply constraints of German colonial possessions. Obviously, the era is totally different, but the economic math, it's exactly the same. When a system is strained at its core, everyday people feel the devastating ripple effects.
The core principle here is a harsh economic reality. When the cost of absolute essentials rises faster than everyday people can adapt, pressure builds remarkably quickly. It really doesn't take much to tip that balance. And history tells us that once that balance tips, restoring stability is vastly more difficult than it would have been to just maintain it in the first place.
Ultimately, the true test for Ireland looking forward will be whether current policies can evolve. Can the government transition from just softening the blow with short-term credits to actually fixing the structural, long-term issues? We're talking about addressing energy dependence at a massive scale and fixing structural housing supply issues so that everyday families aren't held hostage by global markets or a lack of local housing. Because until that gap between wages and costs is permanently closed, the cycle of rising prices, temporary support, and building pressure is just going to continue. We're left sitting at our kitchen tables, looking at our monthly budgets and asking, is the current response enough? And if not, what would it actually take to fix this?